Hi guys, it is a dark, gloomy day. Here in the end times in paradise on Sunday morning, July 22nd, 2018, we are somewhere in the Catskill Mountains on this gloomy Sunday morning. So today, being Sunday, is time for my Doomsday sermon, and I cannot think of a better day. I am in the studio of a real-life doomer chick right here on Humpty Dumpty Tribe, Sister April. And this is Sister April's work in progress, appropriately enough, called A Farewell to Ice. This is April's ode to the upcoming Blue Ocean event that she is chronicling, so I cannot think of a better way to chronicle a farewell to ice. And finally, you knew it was coming. We're going to read from the Bible of the Apocalypse from last year by climatologist Peter Wadhams. A Farewell to Ice, a report from the Arctic, where Peter Wadhams just, he just gets right to the point, guys. We are so fucked. We're toast. The only way out at this point is nuclear power and geoengineering. He's looked at the frying pan and the fire. If we stick with the frying pan, we're toast. And of course, if we jump into the fire, anyway. But so before we get to the not exactly Hollywood ending, this is a definition of a Hollywood ending in the end times, is jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. But anyway, let's jump right into the introduction. This is the last paragraph of the introduction. I have spent my entire scientific life from the age of 21, I think he's about my age now, working on the science of sea ice and the polar oceans. What do these changes mean to me as I prepare to say a personal farewell to this magical landscape? Overwhelmingly, I feel that this is a spiritual impoverishment of the earth as well as a practical catastrophe for mankind. Our own greed and stupidity are taking away the beautiful world of Arctic Ocean sea ice, which once protected us from the impacts of climatic extremes. Now, urgent action is needed if we are to save ourselves from the consequences. But anyway, good Lord, guys, I could pretty much dive in anywhere. Obviously, the majority of this book is looking, at the Arctic and to a lesser extent the Antarctic, but I want to take a more planet-wide romp for what's going on in the Arctic. What does this mean to us in Peoria? So this is what he has to say about weather, events, and food. This is written, came out last year. Extreme weather events have already been found to affect agricultural production as they impinge on the highly productive mid-latitude northern hemisphere agricultural regions. If there is a causal link between them and the retreat of these Arctic sea ice, with all that follows from that, we can expect these extreme events to become the new annual normal, a revised climate cycle for the Earth. The Arctic sea ice is not going to return of its own accord anytime soon, and the continuing increase in greenhouse gas concentrations will ensure via the Arctic amplification that there will be a rapidly warming Arctic over the next many decades. The impact of extreme, often violent weather on crops in a world where the population continues to increase rapidly can only be disastrous. Sooner or later, there will be an unbridgeable gulf between global food needs, otherwise known as demand, and our capacity to produce food in an unstable climate. Inevitably, starvation will reduce the world's population. Scientists desperately hope that there is no link between global warming and this possible change in weather patterns, which is perhaps why they cling to the null hypothesis in the face of increasing evidence to the contrary. The idea that Arctic change may affect lower latitude weather is not new, but it has never been expressed before with a mechanism attached. So he goes and quotes some other researchers, but I'm going to jump ahead to stick to his own sermon. It is these great producing areas, including certainly right here in the U.S., it is these great producing areas which appear to be the most threatened by the polar-linked changes to jet stream location. Any fan of Paul Beckwith knows what we're talking about here. And some countries can apparently see what we fail to see in the West and take self-protection action. China, for instance, has been buying up or leasing agricultural land around the globe, primarily in South America and Africa. The industrial agricultural practices which they introduce lift a small number of farmers out of poverty while impoverishing in the rest. The rest, in the long run, they also damage the soil, biodiversity, drinking water, and river and ocean habitats. But China is positioning itself for the struggle to come, the struggle to find enough to eat. By controlling land in other countries, they will control those countries' food supply. The effect of climate change on food production can also be seen in the Food Price Index, an international measure of global average food prices maintained by the UN Food and Agricultural Organizations. And then he gets kind of technical. I was just talking yesterday, I believe it was, just yesterday, about how the price of lettuce in England has gone up by 30% in the past week as they're importing lettuce from around the world to feed England's salad appetite. Let's see. It is almost always the case that peaks in the food price index are associated with social unrest in those third world countries, such as England, where the cost of food is a large fraction of a person's outgoings. Food cost rather than the absolute absence of food can often be the key factor in shortages and possible starvation. During the height of the Irish potato famine, Ireland was actually exporting food to England. the peasants there starved because they could not afford to buy food at the local prices. There was enough food in absolute terms to keep everyone alive. They died because they had no money to buy it. Yes, and then he goes off into a separate rant onto his biofuels rant. He takes a step away from the climate change and global warming rant, as well as natural factors. He puts natural in quotes, themselves man-made when traced to their origins, such as extreme weather events. We are deliberately making our food situation worse by turning human food crops into biofuel. And he goes off on a rant on biofuels, as he should. Okay, in summary, we know the following three things. Number one, weather patterns in the northern hemisphere in winter and spring have changed in a noticeable way, with greater prevalence of extreme conditions, which leads into number two. This already, as of a year ago, has led to disruptions in food production at a time when the human population is expanding fast and is associated with a rise in the food price index, which could lead to fresh rounds of food deprivation and civil unrest in countries which have difficulty feeding their populations. And number three, if the mechanism is indeed connected with the loss of sea ice in summer, then we cannot expect a natural amelioration. Do you think so? And then let's just do a brief nod to the problem of water. Intertwined with the problem of securing sufficient food for the human race is the problem of water supply. It was drought in Australia that inspired Hubert Wilkins' life work on polar climate. Globally, as the population increases, the number of people living with inadequate water supplies also increases. Wow, this is called water stress. And then he breaks all of this down into a bunch of statistics, and then he talks about that in 2010, 3.6 billion people out of a world population then of just shy of 7 billion people lived under some level of water stress. More than half the world's populations. Do you think so? Per capita water availability is clearly strongly related to population rise, but is also a function of climate change, with warming generally, but not always, leading to drying. A host of other factors also intervenes due to the cavalier way in which we continue to cut down trees and destroy watersheds. There is one direct way in which ice, or the lack of it, contributes to water stress in some parts of the world, such as northern India, the Bolivian plateau, and Tibet. The water supply comes from the spring melt of snow in nearby high mountains, accompanied by the annual runoff from glaciers. If this regular water supply fails because there is not enough snow or ice present in the first place, water stress results. There is no direct connection to sea ice here. It's simply global warming, but water and food shortages certainly tend to go together as two of the dark horsemen that threaten us. And so then in chapter 13, his second to the last chapter, is chapter 13. I love it. The state of the planet. So I'm just going to read, good Lord, and guys, you know, anybody trying to understand what is going on in the Arctic in the year 2018, this A Farewell to Ice. It's a short little book, about 200 pages. Anyway, required reading. The state of the planet. What is the state of the planet 1 year ago? So far, in the first 170 pages, we have focused on climate change in the polar regions, but now it is time to look at the planet as a whole and consider what state we are in. First, there is no let-up in the rate of growth of greenhouse gas concentrations, despite all the fine words of politicians and the efforts made by some countries to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels. The overwhelming effect of fuel-hungry economic growth in China and India is to continue to drive carbon dioxide concentrations ever upward. Given that levels, which have now reached 409, well, that was a year ago, I think it's 411 now, are already too high for non-disruptive climate change. The fact that they are continuing to accelerate upwards with no let-up at all is profoundly distressing. They are not even beginning to slow. And let us remember that all of the CO2 has a potential radiative forcing associated with it, whether it is absorbed for a while in the ocean or in plants. It has by now been taken out of the ground, put into the climate system, and is able to exert that radiative forcing now or in the future to heat the earth. And as we have seen, methane is an even more worrying gas. And he's got a whole chapter on the methane bomb, which could be an entirely other rant. So when methane's level in the atmosphere flattened off in the late 1990s, people were relieved and thought that some law of nature was asserting itself. It wasn't. And as of 2008, methane growth began again and is now approaching the growth rates of the 1980s. It is possibly significant that the resumption of methane growth coincided with large summer retreats of sea ice and associated warming of the Arctic shelf seabed. The link between Arctic offshore processes and global methane levels is becoming more and more firmly established, which means that there is worse to come. Do you think so? Secondly, every planetary indicator looks negative. The human population, now around 7 billion, is projected to reach 9.7 billion by 2050 and 11.2 billion by 2100. It is difficult to see how these numbers can be fed, given that we are experiencing large-scale climate disruption already, which is affecting the breadbaskets of the world. Climate warming is reducing the area of cultivable land in places like sub-Saharan Africa, while theoretically improved yields at high latitudes cannot be realized because of extreme weather events. We are destroying forests. We are running out of water resources, and agriculture, which has to be an intensive, energy-hungry industry in order to feed so many people, is sensitive to shortages of vital raw industrial materials. The Nobel laureate Paul Crutzen, for instance, has drawn attention to the growing shortage of phosphorus, a vital element in the production of artificial fertilizers. The UN population predictions for 2100 are particularly worrying because they are split into continents. Most continents show a large growth in population, but one which can perhaps be coped with, while Europe shows a decline. However, Africa shows a quadrupling in its numbers from 1.1 billion today to 4.4 billion this century. This is why, as I've said, that 3 out of 4 human beings on planet Earth will be born in Africa this century. Since Africa cannot feed itself now, how will it cope with 4 times as many mouths? Well, obviously, I'm breaking you with my own rant. How the fuck do you think it is going? Every single earthling that Africans share the planet with are going to go into the stew pot. It is going to be the single biggest carnage. The megafaunal extinction unfolding in sub-Saharan Africa today is going to rival every megafaunal extinction in the history of the planet, as we can say farewell to every single species of African in Africa. That's exactly how the fuck they're going to cope with it. How do you think they're going to cope with it, Peter? Anyway, getting back, that was my rant. Excuse me, back to Peter's sermon. Since Africa cannot feed itself now, how will it cope with 4 times as many mouths to feed, especially with global warming disrupting food supplies and causing desertification? The answer is that it won't. The rest of the world will have to feed Africa. Given that the rest of the world is likely to be obsessed with their own problems, one can foresee a shortage of compassion and a shortage of aid, meaning foreign food aid. The result inevitably will be famine on a massive scale. How will the world react to this evidence of its own selfishness? I quail at the thought of how nasty humanity may become and of what excuses it will offer for inaction. The population problem, otherwise known as the overpopulation problem, is not just one of food. Every human being is a carbon emitter. This is why I go to say a person who was never born has a carbon footprint of 0. which is another way of saying it. Now I have stabbed myself in the eye with my dollar made in China glasses. So let me see if I still have an eyeball left to read. Okay. The population problem is not just one of food. Every human being is a carbon emitter, and so the problem of reducing total carbon emissions is made much more difficult if there are more people. Wow, I never thought of this, Peter. Every human being needs space for someone to grow the food that he or she requires. So we see massive destruction of forests worldwide at a time when we desperately need more. He uses the word afforestation, by the way. We're going to call it reforestation to reduce carbon dioxide levels. Every human being needs water to drink, and freshwater resources are getting scarcer, so that we may have to depend more on desalination, itself an energy-intensive process that releases more carbon. It is difficult to deny that equation. More people equal more carbon emissions. Yet, we seem to have forgotten the emphasis on the population explosion, which concerned analysts of the global systems in the 1970s, like the authors of the Limits to Growth. The problem has not gone away, and it has not been solved, except for a while by drastic means in China. Economically, the world's rickety financial structure still requires perpetual growth in order to retain its stability with a banking system, the banksters behind it all, which is more and more obviously parasitic upon society. Within the present capitalist system as practiced by everyone, including China, there is no way that a sustainable equilibrium society can be tolerated. This is how many ways can we say this? Everyone knows that exponential growth in everything cannot continue and will lead only to disaster. Well, Peter, I'm sorry, I've just got to blow the whistle. A tiny fraction of human beings on this planet know this. A tiny fraction of human beings on this planet have ever considered the fact that you cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. It is what makes us eco-Nazis. Everyone knows my ass. Nobody knows. Nobody fucking cares, Peter. Anyway, I need to stop getting off on my own sermons. Anyway, back to Peter's drift from reality. Everyone knows that exponential growth in everything cannot continue and will lead only to disaster. Yet every finance minister, and I would say every politician, seeks to encourage more economic growth to get his country out of the financial difficulties which he or his predecessors have created, with no thought of guiding this growth into sustainable channels. You know, this was the center of Manga Bay's rant yesterday about this China's Belt Road Initiative. taking this model all over the planet. Saddest of all is the personal paralysis that one sees in society. In the 1960s, the young in the West were united in great crusades against racism, against the Vietnam War, which showed that they really cared about the state of the world. Now, when the stakes are even higher and the need more urgent, they are passive. Voters of all ages, corporations, and governmental bodies show a lack of concern with building a sustainable planet and concern only with personal wealth and comfort. So long as we consume luxuries, drive our cars, and fly to holiday beaches for a few more years, we are quite willing to close our eyes to the certainty of future disease, poverty, warfare and crime, and ultimate food and resource depletion and starvation, all connected to the pressure of the rapidly changing climate system. The young people are not listening or being inspired to action, and the old are not leading or teaching. If we consulted Mr. McCulber, I'm not sure who that is, he would be telling us that something is bound to turn up to save us from ourselves. But what might that be? Here are a few more or less unlikely scenarios. And then he talks, well, we do have God might decide that it is time for the second coming. We have UFOs might show up to save us. And then don't forget, a miraculous device is invented which offers unlimited clean energy, which of course goes off onto this whole nother rant. Conversely, we might be hit by a gigantic asteroid which wipes out all life. How about some remote African forest region could breed a new strain of virus which sweeps the world and wipes out all, or at least most, human life. And do not forget, we could drift into a major nuclear war. In my view, a policy of waiting for something to turn up is far more likely to produce something bad than something good. Our salvation therefore lies in our own hands and our own actions. And then he finally gets to the somewhat Hollywood ending, what can we do? Where he gets into the Paris Climate Agreement, and he breaks down all of these geoengineering geoengineering ideas, and he goes through and tells why every single one of these geoengineering ideas is unadulterated horseshit. It has no chance of working. And then you know, the Paris Climate Agreement, you know, he talks about why that is an unadulterated bunch of horseshit. And then this is what he calls for, is that he calls for geoengineering. So I don't really get it. Now is the time to focus on bringing in these new technologies. And he's talking about geoengineering and nuclear energy. He's a big proponent of geoengineering and nuclear energy simply because if we don't do anything, we're completely fucked. Now is the time to focus on bringing in these new technologies before emission cut failures lead to squabbling and breakdown of agreement. And so then he ends with a call to arms. A call to arms. So what is his? It is time for battle. All right. Let's get down to the final word in this book. I don't want to, so this is a spoiler if you want to read the book yourself, which you should. Okay, so what we decide to do with this is the most important problem that the world faces. If we solve it, our human civilization can continue, and we can devote our energies to all our other myriad challenges, from overpopulation to water and food shortages, disease and war. If we don't solve it, we are finished. Along the way, we will have said a farewell to ice, but if we stabilize our atmosphere and climate, then the ice may return for our descendants to wonder at and enjoy. So, anyway, no comment. You know, guys, I'm trying to get Peter Wadhams, obviously, for an interview over there on that Collapse Chronicle channel. But you know, can we say apocalyptimist? There's any person on this planet who knows how fucked we are, it's Peter Wadhams. Bring out the nuclear power and the chemtrails, and maybe a farewell to ice. The work in progress will just progress some other direction. But anyway, I highly recommend a farewell to ice, a report from the Arctic, for anybody trying to figure out how completely fucked we are on this planet in 2018. So I'm going to wrap up this sermon, and then I'm going to change my shirt from Humpty Dumpty Tribe. I'm going to put on some brightly colored flower shirt, and we will have this week's Collapse Chronicle on that other channel. Smoke them if you got them, guys, and you know why. Bye, guys.